How the American economy started to fall apart. How's it going, everybody? It's Carpo again. I don't really talk a lot about money systems and the government because it's just such a wide-angle lens you have to look at things through in order to even discuss these issues. And every time I think, well, I want to make a video about this particular subject, I find that my mind starts thinking, oh, well, there's so many more important subjects to talk about, and if you talk about gold, then you have to talk about silver, and you have to talk about the history of it. I'm just going to try to discuss exactly how Americans were robbed of their gold, and how Americans were robbed of any potential wealth. There are a lot of folks who think that, that they trust the government to decide when to print money and how to print money, and don't really ask much more than that. There's a very thick book, I think it's 800 pages. It's called The Creature from Jekyll Island, and by Edward G. Griffin, or was it G. Edward Griffin, one or the other. And it's a great book about the Federal Reserve, but who wants to read an 800-page book about money? And most people aren't interested. So in a nutshell, I want to try to condense some of these issues into this video so people can be aware of how we got to the state that we're in the U.S. economy. Yeah, in 1913, the Federal Reserve was created, and it was basically acting as a central bank. The thing that people don't realize is the Federal Reserve is not federal, and they have nothing in reserve. Basically, it was intended originally to reserve the gold and then decide how much money to issue based on how much gold was in there. And this was in 1913. Well, there was a secret meeting by the Morgans, the Rockefellers, the Rothschilds and Warburgs, big family names and money. And they went to this place called Jekyll Island, and they claimed they were going duck hunting, and they went under cover of night, I guess, with no press, and made sure that this was a top secret meeting about how to deal with the future of America's wealth by a private group of wealthy individuals. So they met, and they decided that they were going to create a system of self-regulation of wealth, and that they would be the deciders of, how the money was issued, how much was printed. They fooled Congress into passing the law really quickly without even reading it. In fact, I believe they didn't even have it printed out yet at the time when, they had Congress sign it. They signed off, I think, near Christmas sometime, like they usually do. And the rest is history. Well, in just a few years later, we sunk into the Great Depression. And what happened was there was a lot of speculative trading and commodities. The stock market basically crashed because there was a lot of insider trading, and there was a lot of buying and selling. I'm not a stock guy. I know there's terms for all these things, but I think it was pump and dump, huge pump and dump schemes, and then the whole economy collapsed. And so, people wanted to blame, oh, well, these are just things that happen, Great Depression, people are out there trying to get food, standing in lines forever. And then 1933 comes around. They decide, and Congress realized, or rather the feds realized, that they have not enough gold in their reserves anymore. The reason for this was because they were sending out and trading gold without having the paper to back it up. So the result was they had to print more money. Well, printing more money is what they call fiat money, and that helps the system decline even faster. That devalues the dollar, and that's what inflation is. So they decided, with their genius plan, that in 1933, FDR declared that all Americans were now forbidden from owning gold. It was illegal from that time on to own any gold in your personal at all, basically. I believe there may have been exceptions for certain coins if they were prior to 1933. And there's an interesting story about the 1933 gold dollars that were printed because they were withdrawn from circulation. Only 2 of them were kept, as I believe at the Smithsonian. And then one of them ended up being auctioned off years later. Then a lady found a roll of 10 of them. The government took them from the family, and it's a really fascinating story. I mean, it reads like a detective novel. It's really interesting. But the Executive Order 6102 in 1933 by FDR made it illegal for Americans to own gold. They considered it hoarding. And so Americans had a period of, I think, a month or so to turn in all of their gold to the Federal Reserve. And you know what's funny? a lot of those pictures you see from the time around the Great Depression, when you see people standing in lines, and a lot of folks say it was them waiting in line as a run on the banks to get their cash. Whoa, something just fell down.
That was crazy.
I'll have to figure that out later. Where was I? Blah, 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 blah. So, he just got way off distracted there. I stacked some stuff on the side of the house yesterday. I was like reorganizing. Something must have collapsed. So anyhow, basically making it illegal for Americans to own gold. They had a month to turn their gold over to the Fed. And when you see those pictures of people standing in lines and they say that they were waiting for the banks, a lot of those are actually pictures of people waiting in line to turn over their gold, because it was punishable by a $10,000 fine and up to 10 years in prison for owning gold. And most Americans don't know this. This went from 1933 all the way to 1974 or 5, I believe, when it was, or maybe it was 1, where it was finally okay to own gold again. And the story behind why that was because a few years before that, we'd gone off the gold standard. Well, technically we went off the gold standard back when the Federal Reserve was created, but we went off of gold exchange in 1964 or 5, I think. That's at least when we stopped printing coins that had real silver in them. And that's the reason why coins were made of silver. A quarter is larger, than a dime, and a nickel's made out of nickel, which is why it's larger than a dime, or was. The coins were supposed to represent real wealth, and sometimes you couldn't have enough coins to pay for something, so you needed a promissory note, and you'd write an IOU, and that's what dollar bills were supposed to represent. You take your gold in, you turn it in, and they give you an IOU, and then you can exchange that for your gold. So people would buy gold certificates, and those were also forced to be turned in. Basically, you were not allowed to own any gold. And so the people went in line to give up their gold, and they were able to stockpile hundreds of tons of gold from this what I call the biggest theft in history. And the people were given certificates, basically exchanged for cash money, for $20.47 per ounce of gold. Once the gold had been turned in and melted down into bars, the very next year, in 1934, FDR raised the price of gold, because they could do that now. The feds were in charge of the gold price. So they raised the price of gold from $20.47 to $35 to make it look like they had more money. Well, in fact, what they did was that declined the purchasing power of all of the money that people got by 50%, meaning that you only got $10 for exchanging your gold, not $20. This actually worsened and lengthened the Great Depression by 7 or more years. And there's a lot of debate about that. Some people say, well, no, there was more to it, and he actually stimulated some of the economy. Because FDR, this was the New Deal that everybody talks about. And my research into it says that it was a travesty. But a lot of folks will claim that it was a great thing, that it actually helped to stimulate the economy. People don't realize that he was funneling money out of the South into the West and East Coasts into the states that were going to help to vote him in. It's always been an issue of corruption within wanting to be reelected and trying to please your constituents. His belief was that the South were already mostly Democrats, so they'd vote for him anyway. And so he had to move and funnel the money to the cities and the coasts in order to have people believe that money was actually flowing in. During this time, farmers were paid to not grow crops. Orchards were left to rot, and 30,000 pigs were slaughtered and left to rot out in the fields. This was done on purpose in order to raise the price of food. So who did that affect? That affected the people who were already suffering through the Great Depression. And on top of that, they have a declined dollar value. So they can, much less purchasing power, and that's what inflation is. So, and now in today's world, when people pay their taxes, they don't realize that it's not going to fix the roads or the bridges or, to help the environmental protection or any of these things. The money that we pay in taxes, the average person is generally going to pay only the interest on the Federal Reserve money that we borrow. So let me reiterate that. The Federal Reserve that was created to help to protect banking from governmental interference decides that they can tax us, the people, on the money that they're printing for us. And so we're paying extra taxes on top of the money that is printed out of thin air with no gold to back it. And I believe today there's less than 1 or 2% of gold to back. I think it's much less if you include credit. There's less than 1% of the actual gold in stock compared to the money that's out there. And some folks say, well, it doesn't matter. Gold has no value. And my thought is, well, gold's had value for the past 10,000 years. Why is that going to stop today? Even if everything fell apart tomorrow, sure, people would still want to eat food more than they'd want gold, but over a period of time, gold would be a commodity that people would use because it's really one of the only options. It's the best option for if you don't have a trade. The idea was gold was to, some people have this dream that we can just barter our way through life. That only works in a small community where everyone is in the same, on the same page. In a larger society, you need a chicken now, and your fruit won't be ready till the fall. And so you need something to say, here's a little bit of something that you can come and buy that back from me later. And that was the whole idea of, the promissory note. But what we ended up getting worse and worse from the 30s up until 64, when we stopped printing, silver coins, and we went off the gold exchange standard. And from here on out, the dollar's purchasing power has just declined. My generation is much worse off than my parents' generation, as far as a lot more people. And the generation, my kids' generation, are going to be worse off than we were. Student loans, a predatory lending system, which has $1 trillion in student loan debt in this country alone. And then we have the Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos, who is actually a major shareholder in a company that collects outstanding debts on schools. It's just absurd. We live in just such an absurd time that even talking about these things seems fruitless. But when I look at today's people, the candidates, all the folks who are in the governmental structure right now, they're really, they can do damage, but it's really irrelevant in the long run, because the banks are the ones that are making the big decisions and pulling the strings. We can vote for whoever we want, but as long as the banks have this kind of power, we're screwed. And then on top of the banking institution, they've created all these predatory lending systems, which are making money on money. And people don't realize this. When there's money being made on money, which is what they call interest, interest was an incentive for people to pay back, but it's become so absurd. 30% on a loan, and where does this extra money go? It drains out the people who can't afford to pay on time. It drowns out the poor, and those who suffer worse, just as what happened under the gold being hoarded by the government. To me, that's one of the most absurd things, but they knew that there's only two ways to make money in this world, and one of them is through, having the metals. The other one would be through having war for profit. And World War II brought us out of that debt because we were able to convince Americans, hey, let's manufacture tanks and bombs and planes, but meanwhile, we also gained a lot of ground in the world, if you will. People's morale was up for a while, and then we realized we were in a perpetual state of war. Then we're into Vietnam and into Korea and all these absurd places, and Americans are saying, what are we doing here? And so all this led up to 2008, when, boom, there was a huge crash. And most people, it was just a blip in history. To the average American who isn't a stock shareholder, doesn't own a huge company or anything, it was just like, 2008, I heard there was it was a hard time to find a job, and that's true, but the bailout was given to the banks, not to the people. Once again, that's what happened before. And this is what happens every time. When you consider somebody too big to fail, it basically means that they're too rich to buy off. And how do you buy off somebody who prints the money? You see what I mean? And so we're stuck in a state of perpetual slavery by using the dollar bill. But what other choice do we really have at this time? So what do? We live in the system, and we hope to educate ourselves on what's really going on, and that's very difficult. And it's in my opinion that the Federal Reserve and the creation of the Federal Reserve is what caused the Great Depression in the first place, at least to an extent, by a side effect of allowing laws to be avoided and companies to be doing trade in very shady ways, let's just say. There wasn't a strong enough government hand in things, but at the same time, you don't want the government to have their hands in your money. That's the problem. What's the solution? Congress is afraid to speak up. No leader or president will speak up against the banking industry. And they have forced us into using their credit cards, debit cards. Basically, you can't even run a business without, being tied into the electronic system. So what do? My thought is we should really try to pass legislation to allow states to run their own economies. This was the original problem, I should note. People were printing their own money, or people were rather printing counterfeits of their state's money, and states were all printing their own money. And some states wouldn't accept other states' money, and banks were popping up all over the place saying, look, we print money, we print money. The Federal Reserve was originally intended to stop this by having one central bank that deals with these things. The problem is dishonesty and ignorance. The idea that we can just print our way out of these problems. The American dollar has lost 35% of its purchasing power over the last 10 years alone. People might not see this coming, but this decline's been a long way coming. Kennedy warned us about it. In fact, a few months before, Kennedy was poised to try to break up this banking cartel, and that's why a lot of people think that, it was a conspiracy. Something like that is about the only thing that definitely they would want to stop, but I don't know the details on that. I don't even buy into that conspiracy side of it because I wasn't there and I don't have the facts. But Jefferson spoke about the banking problem. Lindbergh, it goes way deep. It goes way back into our earliest presidents who said, there's a famous quote by one guy. It's like, you give me control of a nation's money and I care not who, God, I can't remember. I hate it when I forget a quote. Who prints it? Or, whatever. The people, you can read a lot of past quotes that will give you a great insight into how, aware a lot of these people were of what was going on. So we're living through it now, what our, ancestors, forefathers, whatnot, warned us about. Right now, gold sits at about $1,250 an ounce. A couple of years ago, it was up to $1,800, you might remember, if you followed that. And so now it's declined as the American dollar purchasing power starts to increase, or as it appears to increase, which means flooding more money into the system, then gold and silver can drop. When I bought gold years back, it was $15 an ounce. And then it jumped up to $45. And it didn't last, and it dropped back down. Now it's down to $14.50 again. I'm going to go out and buy some again because I don't have much, but it's basically the only hedge against any type of inflation. Even then, you're taking a chance. But if the American dollar totally collapsed tomorrow, out of the blue, what are you going to do? If you have metals, you can always wander off to Canada, exchange your metals. I mean, that's an important thing to consider. Just because we fall apart doesn't mean everybody else will. So, something to consider. Nobody wants to carry huge loads of metal in their backpacks, but it doesn't take much to be worth a lot. I mean, gold itself is too expensive for me. I don't own any at all. But, it would be the one thing that I would like to have as a commodity. And imagine a lot of the people who hoarded gold during this 1933 when they were supposed to turn it in. Of course, there was no records of who had it. Plenty of people stashed theirs away. And then, boom, the next year they just doubled their profits. The billionaires who were able to hoard mass amounts of gold, the true hoarders got away with it. Let's put it that way. And the average citizen had to go down and turn in a few gold coins because they were afraid of going to prison for them. So just remember that next time we think about America as the land of the free and talk about our ancestors and our history, just remember it was illegal to own the only hedge against inflation that a person could possibly have for 50 years in this country. And could it happen again? Not likely. No. And they probably would not be even attempt to go door to door. There's no records of who owns metals, and it would be a worthless cause to them because there's not enough out there. They already have what they want. Control. And I'd like to hear solutions at the bottom. I'd love to give you some, but leave a comment and let me know what your solutions are. And thanks for watching. Take care, everybody. Talk to you later.